Hey everybody, welcome back. I have set the very ambitious goal today of building an entire application out of 3 technologies you may or may not be familiar with. So let's get started. And to tell you how I'm going to go about this, I've broken this down into around 7 steps. Now the first step's outcome is going to look like what we have on our screen right now. So in the center here, we have our fully rendered and operational halftone component. There's an image we fed in of that astronaut, and it's generating a halftone. We can't control it, and that's where this blue part comes in. So this blue part is going to contain a bunch of controls that we use to change the style on our halftone right here. Meanwhile, the halftone is in this red box, this red container, and it's going to keep the aspect ratio, so that's why you can see the sides peeking through here. And on the top, we have a floating header, and on the bottom, we have a floating footer. I'm calling these floating headers and footers just because there are going to be some buttons that are appearing over the white background of the application, and they kind of look like they're floating, so that's why I'm calling them that. Now, normally, I don't color my application with these ugly colors. It kind of looks weird right now, but I feel like it really helps visualize where the components will be and how they're going to be laid out on the page. I do normally start by laying out my application first to an extent, so I think this is very much in the spirit of how I would normally build an application. So we're going to start all this from scratch, so let's dive in. When I say we're going to make an application from scratch, I do mean it. So this is a completely blank application. The very first thing we're going to add is a package.json file. So package.json, and it already gives us the name of our project, halftone in space. Let's add some dependencies. So of course, you already saw the halftone web component. So this is the dependency right here. Since I didn't publish it to NPM, we're just going to grab it from GitHub. This second dependency here, it's lit. We're going to use lit to make our web component-based application a lot easier to develop. Now this last dependency here is Spectrum Web Components. I am installing the entire bundle here. You could install each and every single component that you want to include in your project. The bundle just lets us install everything at once. If you're using TypeScript, it might complain at you that you don't have each individual package, each individual component in this package.json here. I don't care. We're just getting started. We're just learning, and this is a perfectly valid way to go about things. So yes, these are the 3 we're going to install. Let's actually just run npm install and do that right now. All right, look at that. We have a node modules folder, a bunch of Spectrum web components, everything we could possibly ever need. So let's start by just creating a source folder. And within that source folder, we'll make an application folder. Now this application folder, it's going to be our application component. So this is going to be the component that holds everything. And so inside our application folder right here, let's just create app.js. And of course, it wouldn't be a web application without an HTML file. So let's create an index.html file right here. And as you can see, my IDE already started filling things out for us, but let's give this a title, Web Components in Space. I also want to give our page here some style. A lot of applications I build are full screen applications that do not scroll, so this is exactly what this does for us. Our width is 100%, our height takes up the entire page, no margins, so our application is going to butt up to the very edges of our page. No overflow, we don't want this thing to scroll at all, and then the background color can be white. And so since this is a web components-based application, let's add our first web component. HT app. But since we haven't made this a web component yet, it's just going to act like a div, so it's going to work fine for now. Now the last thing I need to add to this page is just import our app.js file that we just made. Still a blank file, but this will get us going. Now back in our app.js file, let's try to see if we can start using lit. And I'm going to do it in a particular way here. I'm going to do it in a very bad way, and it's just to prove a point. So let's start with import HTML and render from, and we're up 2 folders here, so need to back up to our node modules, lit HTML, lit HTML.js. All right. And so let's start using lit, or rather lit HTML, which is a subset of lit. So we're going to render, let's render an h1 tag right into our document. So we're going to say render, and we're going to use that HTML tag template to render an h1 tag that says hi from space. And we're going to render that right into the document.body. And so now, of course, I want to see this. And WebStorm, the IDE I'm using, it has a very nice feature in it that when you click this browser button up here, it launches a simple HTTP server. So let's just do that. And look at this, hi from space. Lit did what we thought it would do. It rendered something into this document body. So what I've done here so far, this doesn't look like any component we're going to use. It's just a very basic way of using lit HTML. But really what I want to show you with this is this very, very long import. And, this is kind of cumbersome. We're 2 levels deep here, but we could be 3 levels deep, or 4, or 1. You don't know until you actually get into your component. And so I think you can kind of tell it's kind of weird here, having to do a different relative path for every time you want to import the same thing. And also, what if we were using TypeScript? We might not want to import a JavaScript file. If lit HTML was a TypeScript file, we might want to do .ts. But guess what? TypeScript doesn't change your file extensions once you transpile. So it really needs to be a JS file. But then if you left it as JS, TypeScript could get screwed up as you're doing development. So you might want to leave the extension off completely. And so this would be good practice. We also don't want to use this whole relative path. We want to say lit. And of course, when we go back and try to load this in our browser again, nothing happens. There's an error. So yeah, failed to resolve module specifier. Now, hypothetically, if we had a smarter server, how would it know how to resolve lit? Well, the answer could be found right in our node modules folder. So let's crack that open. There's also a lit package right here. And so we can start looking in our package.json file. And we can see there's main and module fields that are being used in this package.json. And they point to index.js. And guess what? Even if these fields weren't here, this hypothetically smart server would know because index.js is actually a good default. So that's how a good server would know to serve the index file when you just type shorthand lit. Now, of course, that hypothetical server I'm talking about, it's web dev server. So let's get that installed as well as a dev dependency because this is just our tooling. It's not a main dependency or a runtime dependency of our project. So let's get that installed now. And the last thing we need is something to start up our server here. So let's add that. We're gonna start up web dev server, or actually just, let's say WDS for short. Both will work. We're gonna reach into our node modules bin folder to start this executable. I do this way so people don't have to have WDS installed globally. It just works out of your local node installs. Node resolve. This is the magic that happens that says, what do you mean by lit? Well, I'm going to look it up and see what that means and then resolve it automatically. So this flag is super important for what we're doing. And we're going to open our index.html page when we start up the server. And we're going to add this watch flag. So when we make changes to our code and save it, it's going to refresh the page and show us our new changes. We're calling this serve, but honestly, we could call it anything we want. Anything we want. And now we can just start up our server here by typing npm run anything we want. And again, what's great here is that we're importing lit with this shorthand syntax, and all is working well because of web dev server. Of course, this is a bad name for our task, so I'm going to change it back to serve. Sometimes I'll do dev, sometimes I'll do serve, but again, it can be anything you want. Now I'm going to change our entry point a little bit here. I'm going to add a index.js file. And what I'm going to do in here is export star from app.js. And I'm going to change this to index.js. As you can see, as it automatically refreshes, it still works just fine. So the reason I did it like this is because when we're actually working with our components, you're not going to have a script that's your source is inline like this. What's going to happen is you're going to have code that starts looking like this. Import source app index.js. So that, again, will work just fine. But at the same time, we could actually do this. We can just give it the folder because our entry point is now index.js. So we're getting real short, and of course it still works. And so it's nice not having to like type out the full like double app or index. It's nice just pointing to your component folder and letting it rip. But now since we are, of course, still in our index.html, I'm just gonna move it back to inline source. All right, so now we can actually go back to our app.js file and build a real web component to create our application. The first thing we're going to need is lit element. So lit element can go in the place of this render here. We'll still need HTML, and you'll see why. Now that we're importing lit element, we can just add this right here. So we're saying our class of app, which we're going to fill in, it extends lit element. And now lit element in return extends HTML element, which is something that's baked right into your browser. So it's just a, it acts like a div. Lit element gives us some more goodies to extend that and just help us out creating our web component. Now, before we actually add any logic, let's define our web component. So HTApp is the tag that we're defining with our class app, which matches this. And now HTApp, of course, we want it to work right inside our body here. So HTApp is going to be defined by what we just wrote here, this class. Now, just to render something on the page, we're going to use lit's render function. Now, this render function, it's like a blank function right inside of lit, so we kind of take over for it and tell it what we want to render. And we're going to render or return here an HTML tag template containing the markup we want to add. And now we're going to fill in our rendered HTML with the stuff that we want to lay out here. So this is just normal HTML. You might see some web components that we plan to have in the future, but that's okay. Things like HT side panel, HT floating footer, they will be web components, but they can just act like divs now, because if we don't define them, they're just going to act like divs, and it's all going to work out. Now, you might also notice that we have it inside this containing div. Normally, I wouldn't do this. The web component itself is the containing div. I am adding this for a very good reason that I'll explain in a little bit. But now let's preview this and see what it looks like. So not much of anything it looks like. So let's open our dev tools. And yeah, as we start looking at this stuff, things are there, but everything has a size of 0. So we definitely need some styles now. So the first thing we want to add is our CSS tag template. It's a lot like the HTML tag template. It's just supposed to be used for CSS. Now to get this style added in here, I am going to do static get styles, and is going to return an array, and the array is just going to have the one thing in it, which is a CSS tag template. So let's add our style. So you might not be familiar with this host selector here. So this host is the selector for the web component that we're authoring right now. So we're telling our app web component to take up all the height and width it can be given. So fill it all up. And then the same thing for our inner div. So we have our component, and then inside that we have our div. So this containing div is gonna take up all the width and height we can give it as well. It's also gonna be a flexbox, so it can lay out our side panel right here, and then the rest. And it's gonna flow left to right. So our main container right here, it's gonna have a floating header component, a halftone SVG component, and a floating footer component. And that's why the main container here, it's going to be a flexbox and lay things out as a column. We want it to flow top to bottom. And then the last thing that didn't have any size was this halftone SVG. So we're just gonna make it inline block and give it all the size it can get. And remember, it's sandwiched in between the floating header and the floating footer. So it's gonna take up whatever size it can get and still allow these things to exist. So now as we save this file, let's actually see what it looks like. And here we are, we're mostly there. We have our side panel, we have our floating header, we have our floating footer, we have this in-between stuff, but we are missing our halftone component generator. So to get this halftone SVG working, there's a couple things we need to do. The first thing is we need some assets for it to draw from. So we need some images. So I'm just gonna copy and paste all of these assets into our folder right here. And we have a few. We have an astronaut, the ISS space station, some other space photos. And so the last thing we need to do to get the halftone SVG working, well, let's just take a look and see why it's not working. Open up our dev tools. Now look at that, our halftone SVG. You'll see that it's just the tag. There's nothing inside of there. Now, if you look at our HT app web component that we've just made, you'll see that it has a shadow root. Now, not all web components have shadow roots, but I know that halftone SVG does. So the fact that it doesn't have a shadow root inside there means that it's not registered as a web component yet. So what's wrong? Well, the answer is that nothing's really wrong. We just haven't imported it yet. So let's do that. And as our page refreshes, we can see, hey, we have everything we set out to do in this step. So we're a good portion of the way there. So this is great. So now, before we move on to next steps, I want to call out something big here. And it's one of the major reasons I like working with web components. And that's style encapsulation. So you'll notice that we're using halftone SVG here as a selector. We're also using this ID of main container. And because we're in this encapsulated area right here, we're inside of a web component that has a shadow DOM, I could have other main container IDs elsewhere in my application, and it wouldn't matter. This would still work just fine, and they wouldn't conflict. Likewise, we're styling a div here. And if you've been in web development for a long time, you might think that's a very stupid thing to do because we're just trying to style this one div. But it happens to be the only div we have inside of our component here. And so it's not going to affect other divs we might have in our application. So yeah, before this whole shadow DOM encapsulation thing came along, I might be tempted to use some, Sass or Less or some other organizational system to manage my CSS. But now I can just do, honestly, stupid looking things like styling a div and not worry about what it does to the rest of my applications. So yeah, this is one of the amazing things that I think web components really shine with.